They came to my door unannounced, faces stern, badges shining. But these weren't the kind of officers I expected. The HOA had called them, claiming I'd violated rules no one had ever told me existed. My heart pounded as they stepped onto my property, each footfall echoing like a warning. I had followed every guideline, every regulation, or so I thought. Yet here they were, accusing me, judging me, threatening fines and legal action. The worst part? My wife was home, alone, calm, and I knew she wasn't someone to be trifled with. But would they? Did they even know who they were messing with? As I watched the confrontation unfold, disbelief turned into a chilling sense of dread. How could a neighborhood association, people who lived next door, have so much power to invade our lives, our sanctuary, our home? Every rule, every clause suddenly felt like a weapon, wielded with precision to intimidate and control. I kept my distance, heart racing, waiting for the inevitable. But what happened next changed everything. In a matter of moments, the entire dynamic flipped in a way no one could have predicted. What they didn't realize could cost them everything. Will they walk away unscathed, or face a shocking twist that no HOA could ever see coming? Life in our quiet suburban neighborhood had always felt safe, predictable, almost comforting. Tree-lined streets, neatly trimmed lawns, and houses that reflected pride and care. It was the kind of place where people waved at one another on morning walks, and kids played freely until the sun dipped below the horizon. That was the world my family and I had built, a small sanctuary from the chaos of the outside world. My wife, a calm and methodical presence, balanced work and home with an effortless grace, while I handled the household chores and weekend projects. We were just like every other family in the neighborhood, polite, respectful, and careful to follow every rule, every guideline the HOA laid out. Our life was structured but peaceful, filled with small joys, a cup of coffee on the porch at sunrise, the sound of our dog running across the yard, the quiet laughter echoing from inside our home. Yet beneath the veneer of tranquility, there were always undercurrents we barely noticed. Some neighbors seemed far too concerned with the tiniest imperfections, a slightly overgrown bush, a mailbox slightly off-center, or the color of a front door. We laughed it off, believing everyone had their quirks, and never imagined how quickly those quirks could evolve into relentless scrutiny. The HOA itself was a shadowy presence in the background, a group of volunteers who, on the surface, managed community rules and ensured uniformity. They hosted meetings, sent newsletters, and occasionally issued gentle reminders about minor infractions. To most residents, this was merely part of living in a well-kept neighborhood. To us, it was a mild inconvenience, something to nod at politely and then forget. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary until the first letter arrived. It was short, formal, and coldly precise, a notice of violation that seemed trivial at first glance. The tone, however, hinted at a deeper rigidity, an unspoken demand for compliance that went beyond simple rules. My stomach sank as I read the lines. The HOA claimed there were issues with our property, small matters that we had never been informed were problems. But the language, the precision, and the insistence felt like a warning. I glanced at my wife, whose calm expression barely masked a flicker of unease. Something about the phrasing, the implication that our very way of life could be scrutinized, ignited a quiet tension between us. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A storm was brewing, one that would test our patience, challenge our sense of justice, and push us into a confrontation we could never have predicted. In the background, the neighborhood hummed with its usual rhythm, children laughing, sprinklers spraying, mail carriers delivering letters.
Yet beneath that idyllic surface, the first threads of conflict were weaving themselves into our lives. We didn't know it yet, but the next time someone knocked on our door, our world would shift dramatically.
At first, the notices seemed minor. An extra letter slipped under the door, a terse email that I almost ignored. "Your mailbox flag is not aligned with HOA regulations," one read. "The hedge on the north side of your property exceeds the allowed height by 2 inches." 2 inches. I stared at the perfectly trimmed greenery, incredulous. My wife, ever composed, simply shook her head and filed the notices in a folder labeled HOA Correspondence. But then the letters became more frequent, each one sharper than the last. They arrived almost daily, accusing us of violations that didn't exist or rules that were conveniently hidden in the fine print of the HOA handbook. A minor crack in the sidewalk, which had been there for years, suddenly warranted a citation. Our garbage cans were, according to a new amendment no one had notified us about, supposed to be stored behind a fence we didn't even own yet. Every notice was accompanied by the threat of fines, escalating with each passing day. I tried reasoning with the HOA. I emailed, I called, I attended their meetings. Each time I was met with the same cold, bureaucratic responses. Rules are rules. We are following procedure. Compliance is mandatory. The neighbors, once friendly, seemed to watch with a mixture of curiosity and silent judgment. We were being singled out, targeted for reasons that no one could or would explain. Then came the first in-person confrontation. 2 board members appeared at our door unannounced, clipboards in hand, I scanning the property as if we had invited them to critique every blade of grass. My wife, ever composed, simply shook her head and filed the notices in a folder labeled HOA Correspondence. But then the letters became more frequent, each one sharper than the last. They arrived almost daily, accusing us of violations that didn't exist or rules that were conveniently hidden in the fine print of the HOA handbook. A minor crack in the sidewalk, which had been there for years, suddenly warranted a citation. Our garbage cans were, according to a new amendment no one had notified us about, supposed to be stored behind a fence we didn't even own yet. Every notice was accompanied by the threat of fines, escalating with each passing day. I tried reasoning with the HOA. I emailed, I called, I attended their meetings. Each time I was met with the same cold, bureaucratic responses. Rules are rules. We are following procedure. Compliance is mandatory. The neighbors, once friendly, seemed to watch with a mixture of curiosity and silent judgment. We were being singled out, targeted for reasons that no one could or would explain. Then came the first in-person confrontation. 2 board members appeared at our door unannounced, clipboards in hand, I scanning the property as if we had invited them to critique every blade of grass. My wife calmly stepped outside, her presence commanding yet unassuming, while I stood behind her, tense and uncertain. They rattled off a list of violations, pointing at things that seemed trivial to anyone else: a slightly crooked wind chime, a garden gnome positioned improperly according to the HOA's obscure aesthetic code. Each accusation felt like a calculated move, designed to provoke and intimidate. The absurdity was infuriating, but my frustration was tempered by caution. We knew any wrong word could be twisted into defiance. I wanted to shout, to demand they leave, but I bit my tongue, documenting every interaction instead. Fines began appearing in our mailbox, each one larger than the last. A $150 notice for an uneven lawn, $250 for unauthorized exterior decoration. The letters were methodical, almost gleeful in their cruelty, and always signed by the same HOA president, a woman who seemed to delight in wielding power over those who dared to maintain normal lives. Our once peaceful home became a minefield. Friends hesitated to visit, worried about being caught in the crossfire. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors. Even the mail carrier, usually cheerful and unbothered, began delivering letters with a subtle air of caution. The stress seeped into every corner of our lives. My wife, despite her stoic nature, stayed up late at night poring over HOA rules, searching for loopholes or errors. I, meanwhile, spent hours photographing our property, compiling evidence, and drafting carefully worded responses. But the harassment didn't stop at letters or fines. The HOA board took it a step further.
One morning, I returned from work to find a notice taped to our front door. You are being reported for unauthorized activity on your property. There was no explanation, only a warning that further action will be taken if compliance is not achieved. That night I couldn't sleep. The words were played in my mind, each sentence heavier than the last. Was someone actually watching our home? Was this a prelude to something worse? Then came the neighbors. At first, it was subtle. Comments about our lawn, whispers when we walked past, invitations politely declined without explanation. But soon it escalated into more direct interference. A neighbor blocked our driveway during a party, forcing guests to park half a block away. Another reported us to the city for minor landscaping infractions, prompting an inspector to visit and scrutinize every corner of our property. Even mundane activities like washing the car or hanging a flag became potential hazards, each one a trigger for yet another complaint. The tension reached a boiling point when we received an official letter, this one marked urgent. The HOA claimed we had failed to comply with multiple infractions, threatening not only steep fines but legal action if we did not correct them immediately. The instructions were impossible to follow fully. Some were contradictory, others downright nonsensical. It was clear the intent wasn't correction, it was control. Despite our careful documentation, our polite responses, and our attempts to negotiate, the situation worsened. The board's tone became increasingly aggressive, bordering on personal attacks. Our family felt under siege. I remember one afternoon sitting on the porch, staring at our carefully maintained garden, wondering how something as simple as home ownership could turn into a war zone. The mailbox, once a benign part of daily life, now felt like a threat, a reminder that we were being targeted relentlessly. And then came the incident that changed everything. We were outside, my wife tending to the garden, when a truck with official-looking markings pulled up. Two men stepped out, badges glinting in the sunlight. My heart stopped. The HOA had called the authorities. They were here. My wife raised her head slowly, calm and measured, but I could see the barely contained tension in her eyes. Every muscle in my body tightened. What they didn't know was who she really was. The men approached cautiously, following protocol, their voices firm yet professional. I wanted to step forward to intervene, but I was frozen by a mix of fear, disbelief, and anticipation. My wife's gaze never wavered, her presence commanding without a word. I could feel the power dynamic shifting, almost imperceptibly, yet palpably. The situation teetered on a knife's edge, every second stretching into eternity. What happened next would turn the entire dispute on its head. In that moment, the petty rules, the fines, the constant harassment, all of it, became insignificant compared to the shocking revelation about the woman standing silently on our lawn. The HOA had overstepped, underestimated, and misjudged entirely. And in the blink of an eye, the balance of power was about to flip in a way no one could foresee. Would the HOA realize their mistake before it was too late? Or had they ignited a chain of events that would leave them humiliated and powerless?
The sun had barely risen, but the tension in the air was palpable. Our quiet suburban street, usually calm and predictable, now felt charged, as though every neighbor, every tree, even the wind was holding its breath. That morning, we knew something pivotal was about to happen. Weeks of harassment, fines, petty rules, and intimidation had built to a breaking point. My wife stood in the center of the driveway, hands clasped, radiating a calm that belied the storm brewing around us. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears, each beat a countdown toward the confrontation we could no longer avoid. The HOA president appeared first, flanked by two board members, clipboards in hand, their expressions smug, triumphant, convinced that they had orchestrated the perfect ambush. They had arrived armed with a stack of notices, photos, and a sense of self-righteous authority that had grown with every petty infraction they imagined. Their eyes scanned our property, lingering on each detail as though they were deciphering a secret code that only they could interpret. "We're here to enforce compliance,"
the president declared, voice tight with authority, dripping with the satisfaction of someone who believed they held the ultimate power. We've documented every violation, and fines will continue to accrue until you conform to HOA standards. I felt a knot of anger tighten in my stomach. All of the letters, all of the threats, all of the humiliation my family had endured, this was the culmination. And yet, there was one element the HOA had utterly failed to account for. My wife. The moment she stepped forward, everything changed. She wasn't just calm, she was commanding. Every step measured, every glance precise. Her badge caught the sunlight, glinting briefly as the wind rustled her hair. The board members froze, uncertainty flickering across their faces as realization slowly dawned. This wasn't just a homeowner. They had called in law enforcement against the sheriff of the county. Their smug confidence evaporated like mist in sunlight. For a heartbeat, time seemed suspended. I could see their minds racing, trying to reconcile their perception of control with the sudden, undeniable truth. The letters, the fines, the arbitrary inspections, they had been built on the assumption of compliance through fear. And now, that assumption was shattered. "What? You're—" stammered the HOA president, her voice wavering for the first time. She gestured toward the documents in her hand as though waving them might restore the illusion of authority. But it was futile. Every paper, every citation, every threat now felt meaningless. My wife's voice, calm but sharp, cut through the tension. "You were given multiple warnings to follow the proper procedures. You escalated this situation unnecessarily, threatening my family. You crossed the line." She didn't raise her voice, didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her presence alone conveyed a power they couldn't contest. The board members shifted uncomfortably. Their eyes darted between her and the documents, as though willing the fines and citations to validate themselves. But the legal authority that underpinned our lives, the law, fairness, and now my wife's badge rendered them powerless. This was the first time they were facing real accountability. Then came the moment that truly flipped the situation. She calmly retrieved her phone and began recording the encounter, capturing every word, every gesture, every attempt at intimidation. The HOA president's earlier confidence began to crumble into visible panic. Their rehearsed lines, their carefully curated sense of control faltered. Now any misstep could and would be documented. The tension escalated further when a few neighbors, drawn by the commotion, gathered at the edge of the street. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some had secretly sympathized with us all along. Others had been intimidated into silence by the HOA's overreach. But now, seeing the president flounder, seeing the sheriff standing unshaken, a shift occurred. The balance of power was not only broken, it was reversing. The president tried a final maneuver, pointing at a stack of supposedly overdue fines and a threatening legal notice. "You will be held liable if you do not comply," she barked. But my wife's gaze never wavered. Liable? Perhaps. But first, let's review whether any of this follows the bylaws or state law. I suggest you step back before you escalate this further, because the next call could be from my office, not yours. There was a pause, pregnant, heavy, almost cinematic. Every board member exchanged glances. They had underestimated not only her authority, but also the consequences of their arrogance. Their intimidation tactics, their petty vendettas, the countless hours they spent scrutinizing trivial details, they all crumbled under the weight of one simple truth. They had played with people who refused to be intimidated. Then came the final blow. One of the more outspoken board members, trying to regain some semblance of composure, attempted a cutting remark about community standards and example setting. My wife didn't flinch. Instead, she detailed, step by step, how their citations were procedurally flawed, selectively enforced, and in some cases, legally unenforceable. Every word struck with precision, exposing not only the pettiness, but the recklessness of their actions. By the time she finished, the president's face had turned pale. The other board members avoided eye contact, murmuring excuses, muttering about meetings, procedures, anything that might justify their behavior. But it was too late. The narrative had shifted entirely. The community, previously a silent observer, had now witnessed the unraveling. Their authority was gone, their intimidation nullified. As the board retreated, flustered and humiliated, the neighbors remained, exchanging glances that conveyed relief, astonishment, and even admiration. The once quiet street buzzed with energy, a subtle but undeniable victory reverberating in the air. My wife, calm and composed, stood at the center of it all, a beacon of authority and justice in a landscape previously dominated by fear and arbitrary control. And yet, even as we watched the HOA scatter, a lingering question remained. Could this victory hold? Would they attempt another form of retaliation, more subtle, more insidious? The ordeal wasn't over. This confrontation was only the most dramatic chapter in a story that had already upended our lives. As we closed the gate behind them, my wife turned to me, eyes steady, voice quiet but resolute. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about ensuring no one else suffers under their arbitrary rule. Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication, leaving me and the viewers wondering, had we truly seen the end of their power, or merely the calm before another storm?
The sun was setting on our street, casting a warm, golden glow across lawns that had once felt like battlegrounds. After the dramatic confrontation with the HOA, an uneasy calm settled over our home. At first it was almost surreal. The quiet, the lack of letters under the door, the absence of phone calls from officious board members demanding compliance or payment. It felt like stepping into a world that had been on pause, a moment to breathe after weeks of relentless tension and fear. But beneath the calm lay a deeper understanding. The storm wasn't over, not entirely, but we had survived the worst of it. And in doing so, we had gained something far more valuable than mere reprieve. In the immediate aftermath, we took stock of the situation. The HOA had retreated, humiliated and disarmed by the presence of my wife in her official capacity. The once omniscient authority that had dictated our lives through petty rules, threats, and fines now seemed almost powerless, diminished by the revelation that their power was conditional, fragile, and ultimately unenforceable when confronted with truth and accountability. Our victories were small in some ways, a few fines canceled, some citations officially rescinded, but monumental in others. The psychological weight of intimidation had lifted, replaced by a sense of reclaimed agency. Our neighbors, who had watched silently, slowly began to engage differently. Some approached us cautiously at first, offering apologies for their earlier complicity, or quietly expressing relief that someone had stood up to the board's abuses. Others sought guidance, asking how they could protect themselves should similar harassment occur. It became clear that the HOA's influence had been as much a psychological prison as a legal one, instilling fear that prevented ordinary homeowners from questioning or resisting arbitrary authority. By standing firm, we had not only defended our own home, but had sparked a ripple effect across the community. The board itself was forced to reassess its operations. Some members resigned quietly, unwilling to face legal or public scrutiny. Others attempted to rationalize their actions, rewriting minutes from meetings, adjusting rules, and issuing belated apologies that rang hollow to those of us who had endured weeks of undue stress. The HOA structure remained in place, but its aura of invincibility had been shattered. What once had seemed omnipotent was now a fragile human institution, prone to error,
hubris, and miscalculation. On a personal level, the experience left lasting impressions on our family. My wife, despite her already formidable presence, became a symbol of measured authority and unwavering resolve in our neighborhood. Children waved as we passed, neighbors smiled more openly, and the sense of tension that had pervaded the street slowly dissolved. For me, the ordeal was a lesson in patience, strategy, and restraint. The realization that confronting injustice requires not only courage, but a disciplined approach that balances emotion with calculated action. We also took steps to ensure the future. Legal consultations clarified our rights as homeowners, and we meticulously documented every interaction moving forward. We revised our own routines, proactively maintaining our property in ways that respected both the law and common sense, while also safeguarding against petty or arbitrary complaints. The goal wasn't to cower or comply blindly. It was to assert that we could live our lives free from undue interference while still respecting the community's legitimate expectations. Over the following months, subtle but profound changes unfolded. The HOA, wary of further confrontations, began to act with more transparency. Meeting agendas were posted openly. Rules were clarified, and communication became less threatening, more procedural. Residents who had once hidden in fear now participated in discussions, offering input and holding board members accountable. The balance of power had shifted. Rather than a few individuals dictating the lives of the many, the community had become a collective, informed, and engaged entity. The psychological aftermath was equally significant. My family and I felt a renewed sense of autonomy, a recognition that standing firm against unjust authority, done thoughtfully and strategically, could yield transformative results. Every day felt lighter. Tasks that had once seemed fraught with anxiety, like tending the garden or hosting friends, now carried a sense of freedom and joy. The home, previously a site of tension and uncertainty, had become what it was always meant to be: a sanctuary, a place of comfort, creativity, and connection. Yet the lessons extended beyond our household. The broader community now understood that compliance does not equate to silence, and that accountability is not merely a theoretical principle. It is actionable, enforceable, and necessary. Residents began documenting HOA communications, attending meetings, and challenging overreach with evidence rather than emotion. The fear that had once pervaded every mailbox, every front yard, every casual neighborly interaction had dissipated, replaced with vigilance and empowerment. In the weeks that followed, the HOA attempted minor challenges.
Requests for minor adjustments to landscaping, procedural reminders, but each was met with calm, documented responses. The difference was striking. No longer did we respond out of fear. We responded from a position of informed confidence. The dynamic had changed, permanently. The board had learned that intimidation, when wielded without justification, carries consequences, and that the strength of a community is not measured by its adherence to arbitrary rules, but by its capacity for fairness, transparency, and mutual respect. Reflecting on the journey, the experience highlighted the thin line between order and tyranny. HOA rules, in theory, exist to preserve aesthetics and harmony. In practice, they can become instruments of control, pettiness, and abuse when applied without transparency or accountability. Our confrontation with the board revealed how quickly authority can shift from guidance to oppression, and how critical it is for citizens to recognize and assert their rights before minor infringements escalate into systemic harassment. Emotionally, there was also the satisfaction of witnessing justice meted out without malice. We did not retaliate in anger or seek revenge. Instead, we relied on truth, authority, and measured action. That approach allowed us to reclaim not only our home, but also our dignity.
setting a precedent for others who might face similar circumstances. The narrative was no longer one of fear and helplessness. It was one of empowerment and principle. In the long term, our story became a quiet cautionary tale in the neighborhood. New residents were advised to understand HOA rules thoroughly, document interactions meticulously, and never underestimate the importance of measured, strategic response to petty authority. We received messages from former neighbors who had endured similar harassment elsewhere, expressing gratitude and curiosity, eager to learn how we had navigated what had seemed an impossible situation. Ultimately, the experience crystallized a powerful truth. Communities thrive when accountability exists on all sides. Power without oversight is fragile. Intimidation without transparency is doomed to fail. By standing firm, documenting thoroughly, and leveraging legitimate authority wisely, ordinary homeowners can counteract arbitrary power, defend their dignity, and foster a stronger, more engaged community. As the final weeks passed, the street regained its rhythm. Children laughing, sprinklers running, neighbors chatting. But the atmosphere was different, lighter, freer, imbued with the subtle confidence that comes from surviving and indeed prevailing over undue authority. The ordeal had left its mark, not as trauma, but as empowerment. My family's daily life resumed, but with a sharper awareness and a deeper respect for the boundaries between legitimate governance and petty domination. Looking back, the most profound takeaway was simple yet enduring. Courage combined with strategy can dismantle even the most oppressive systems. It isn't about confrontation for its own sake. It's about understanding the rules, documenting evidence, and asserting rights calmly and decisively. In doing so, one not only protects personal well-being, but also contributes to a stronger, fairer, and more transparent community. And in that quiet, golden evening light, standing on our porch looking across the street, it became clear the battle was over, but the lesson, the empowerment, and the vigilance it inspired would last a lifetime. Because sometimes, the smallest neighborhood disputes reveal the deepest truths. Courage matters, fairness prevails, and those who wield power without accountability will always face the reckoning they sought to avoid.